And we're here to hear from Dr. Kirsten Beurs. And before we begin, I will ask you all to turn on your cameras for this introduction at least. And I have a little something to read. So Dr. Kirsten Beurs is a presidential professor in geography and environmental sustainability at the University of Oklahoma. Her research focuses on the analysis of Earth observation data to detect, assess, and attribute ongoing changes in terrestrial ecosystems. She is an author on 92 research papers and peer-reviewed book chapters, and she has been the PI or co-PI on several successful nationally competitive proposals totaling more than $3 million. She's also an editor for AGU's journal, Earth's Future. So without further ado, can't wait to hear from you, Dr. Beurs, about land use patterns and political instability as predictors for the re-emergence of malaria in the Caucasus.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you so much for putting this all together. I'm very excited to see all the students active. I'm sorry that we're doing this over Zoom. I have to say my kid actually was just tested positive for COVID, so it kind of works out on my side because I would not have been able to come. We have been able to afford it for 2 years, and now here we are. So very briefly, you already did a great introduction. I'm a professor in the Department of Geography. I'm really interested in remote sensing. And remote sensing is basically the use of satellite data or other kind of observations from afar to understand mainly our land surface. So in geography, we would love to study our land surface and the patterns on the land surface and who lives where and what are they doing and how are they affecting themselves and the environment around them. I'm really interested in kind of the combination of land cover and land use change and also climate change. So if you're thinking about climate change, and this I know conference is a lot about climate change, climate is changing all the time. It's really impacting the way our land looks, but people are there too, and they're also impacting the way the land looks. And so how can we separate those two patterns? And how can we understand what is happening because of what? And how do these type of things interact? So sometimes as people, we will do different things because the climate is changing, which we can then also see in our land surface. I'm also the director of an online master's program in geospatial technologies. And so this is a program where we're teaching students all about GIS and remote sensing. It's entirely online, and it has been really quite fun working with the students all over the country. So today I want to talk about the impact of malaria on the Caucasus and why malaria came back in the Caucasus. So first of all, malaria was very prevalent in many parts of the world. Nowadays, we often think about malaria as maybe more of a tropical disease. And so if you're kind of looking at this map, the different colors tell you when that part of the world became free of malaria. And so if you're looking in most of Europe, I am actually from the Netherlands. So if you're looking at most in Europe here, by 1946, or even sometimes by the 1900s, those areas were free of malaria. And certainly when I was growing up, malaria was not something we ever thought about in the Netherlands, even though it was super prevalent there, all throughout the 1800s and so forth. I am really interested in the Caucasus, which is right here between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And of course, the Caucasus used to be part of the Soviet Union back in the early 1900s. So I wanted to show you this map. This is a map about malaria in the 1920s. And malaria was actually super prevalent in the 1920s in the Caucasus. So if we're looking here, this is the Black Sea, this is the Caspian Sea, this kind of is the Volga River Valley going up into Russia. And you can see that the number of cases per 100,000 of malaria in the southern areas here, are sometimes more than 10,000. And so there were more than 10,000 people per 100,000 people that were sick with malaria in 1922. So that's a lot. Over 1 million malaria cases were found in 1923 in the Lower Caucasus, and it presented approximately 50% of the total infectious disease burden in malaria. So again, that is really quite a bit. So I really want to talk very briefly about the life cycle of mainly Plasmodium vivax. So after infection, the parasite enters the human body, and there it can remain in dormancy actually for quite a long time. And the patient may suffer from malaria for up to 4 years. And symptoms, they tend to occur every second month. And this dormancy is actually very important for the rest of our story. It's very important for maintaining malaria in temperate regions and also for malaria reintroduction, because once malaria enters your body, you can actually travel with it and bring it with you when you go to a new place. So in this conference, we're talking a lot about climate. And so I do want to talk a little bit about climate, and it's in the sense of, is this region even, climatologically suitable for malaria infections? And it turns out it very much is. And so there's a lot of Russian researchers that have looked at where can malaria occur. And one of the things they said is that for the development of P5X to occur, you have to have an average daily temperature of more than 16 degrees. And then if that condition is met, we can kind of start playing a little bit with these different temperature metrics. And so we sum up all the daily temperatures that are over 14.5 degrees Celsius. And then the thinking is that if the sum reaches 105 degrees, then we can have a maturation of one generation of P5X. And if the sum is more than 210 degrees, then we can have two consecutive generations. And so that is really what we need if we want to have emergence of indigenous cases. And so if we're looking at this map here, again, here's Russia, here's the Black Sea, Kazakhstan, Turkey, and Iran. This is the Caucasus. There's a really big mountain range here in the Caucasus, which caused temperatures to really go down. But you can see that most of this area here in southern Russia is actually just fine with respect to malaria development. So temperature-wise, climatologically, that region is very suitable for malaria development. And in fact, along the Volga River, there's a lot of marshy areas. And so otherwise, it's also a very positive area if you wanted to develop malaria. Now, this is a map from 1995, which is actually when malaria came back big time in the Caucasus. We can do this for every year. And so I picked another year here in 2020, and you can actually see that 2020 is a lot cooler. And so, you can see that these northern parts of Russia then became unsuitable for malaria development, while the south still very much is very suitable for malaria development. So let's talk a little bit about the eradication during the Soviet period. So officials in the Soviet Union developed very Soviet methods to expand rural health initiatives. The states were required to develop plans for mosquito eradication, and they also started to really control breeding sites and construction sites. From 1946 to 1951, they did a major DDT spraying campaign that extended over nearly 200 square kilometers. Nowadays, luckily for us, obviously spraying DDT is not really what we want, and we have learned that maybe we get rid of malaria, but we introduce a whole host of other problems. But to a certain extent, this was really an effective mechanism, and overall malaria rates declined from 41 per 10,000 to in 1950 to about a little bit less than 10 per 10,000 in 1952. And by 1960, malaria was all eradicated. And then the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, and that resulted in a whole bunch of ethnic conflicts in the Caucasus. So in the Caucasus, there were three major conflicts in the 1990s. There was the conflict in Chechnya, and many of you probably have heard about that. There were ethnic militias versus the Russian state. There was a three-way conflict in Georgia, where there were three different breakaway regions. And then there was a conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, mainly surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh. Common features of these three conflicts was that there was ethnic cleansing. There were territorial militias that really predated the national armies. So these countries, they were part of the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union fell apart, they became independent countries, but these countries didn't really have their own independent armies just yet. So they had a bunch of different factions and militias going around. There was a lot of stateless space, and that resulted in no public health surveillance. And as a result, ultimately, there was multiple outbreaks of preventable diseases. So malaria came back, but there were many preventable diseases that came back at the same time. Very briefly about the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Some of you may remember that earlier last year, there was actually another kind of outbreak of that conflict, which is still simmering. So the original outbreak between Armenia and Azerbaijan largely began in the fall of 1987. There were protests over inequality and work conditions in this mountainous area. So Nagorno-Karabakh sits right here. Azerbaijan sits right here and basically says this is from us, and Armenia says no, this is really this entire area is our Armenian area. And so there was protest over inequality of work conditions, and then from 1992 to 1994, the Karabakh region really endured repeated cycles of bombing. By 1994, everybody got kind of tired of this, and so they had a ceasefire, but by then 350,000 people were already expelled, and agriculture production, transportation, and then other basic institutions were all basically either really disrupted or completely destroyed. And that's when you had an outbreak of malaria. And so if you're looking here, these are the malaria cases that were found per basically province or state. This yellow area here is the area where Nagorno-Karabakh, the original Nagorno-Karabakh, was situated. The border has since changed. Armenia sits over here, and then Azerbaijan sits over here, and you can see all these areas here in the south. There was a major outbreak of malaria that then went on as well in Baku, in the capital, and then also was brought over to Yerevan, in the capital of Armenia and south of Yerevan. These little tent-like structures show your refugee locations, and so people left Nagorno-Karabakh and ended up in refugee camps right around this area where there was a lot of malaria. So our project set out to understand, how did this outbreak happen, right? Once you get rid of a situation where there's malaria, once you have eradicated malaria, how does it come back, right? We know the ingredients, meaning we have the climate, we have the environment for malaria. They are there, they have been there, they have always been there. The Netherlands has the same ingredients, right? We could have environmentally and climatologically malaria in the Netherlands, but we don't. And so why do we not have that? And how does it come back if you get rid of it? And so what made the natural environment conducive to uncontrolled reproduction of P5X in human populations? And in this case, I really want to focus, because we have limited time, on surface water and then deforestation. And then I'll bring it back to climate and people movements. So first of all, we're interested in environmental disturbance. So environmental disturbance and political instability really generate widespread areas where we could generate suitable mosquito habitats. And so what we wanted to do is basically map these areas where there is water and come up with really accurate surface water data sets, which can capture smaller water bodies than that is easily available normally. And so what we started out doing is we started looking at an interesting set of satellite data. So the Landsat Satellite Data Program is an American flown program. The United States launches Landsat satellites and has been doing so basically from 1984 on. And so we have had several Landsat satellites up. These satellites fly all over the world. So even though this is a US-based program, these satellites fly all over the world, and everywhere around the world, they make a picture approximately every 16 days, okay? And so we have satellite images with a spatial resolution of 30 meters, meaning every grid cell covers about 30 by 30 meters, all over the world, approximately every 16 days, okay? Now, when there's clouds, these satellites will record clouds. So they're not some magic, satellite that can go through the clouds. It's not a radar data set that can actually look through the cloud. It's optical data, as we call it. So it records it as if you would be flying in an airplane looking down with the same eyes. If you're flying above the clouds, you'll see clouds. If there's no clouds, then you can see the land, okay? These data sets, they fly with what we call several spectral bands. And so you and I, we can see in blue, green, and red most of the time, right? So we're pretty good in perceiving the world in blue, green, and red. But with satellites, we can also record the data, for example, in the near infrared or the shortwave infrared. And these bands that you and I cannot see with our bare eyes can really be helpful when we're trying to understand what is going on our land surface. There's also kind of global data sets available. So there's a global surface water data set that we wanted to use and then compare. So here's what we call a spectral profile. And actually, the way a spectral profile works is that on the x-axis, you have your wavelengths. And so when we're looking with our own eyes, we look in blue, green, and red. And blue, green, and red sit right here, more or less where 1, 2, and 3 sit. So that's blue, green, and red. We call that a visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum. There's also near infrared, and then what they call here intermediate infrared. And every land service has a slightly different signature, we call them sometimes spectral signature, of how they reflect light. Okay, so if we're looking here at water, you can see water absorbs a lot of light. It doesn't really reflect a lot of light. And so water is usually kind of dark on these images. This green curve is vegetation. This little bump here in the green is because it actually tells you that we see our vegetation as green, right? If there was a bump in the blue or a bump in the red, then we would see the vegetation as blue or as red, but we actually see the vegetation in green. So there's slightly more reflectance in green than there is in the blue and in the red, but then you can also see there's a lot of reflectance in the near infrared. And then this one is soil. And so you can start to see that every land surface shows itself slightly differently with these spectral signatures. And we can use these spectral signatures to identify what's going on the land. So to be able to do that kind of fast and with some sort of certainty, we develop what we call spectral indices, where we combine these different bands into one index that we can then link with the land service and say, okay, well, if this index is high, it's most likely water. If this index is low, it's most likely vegetation, and so forth. So we do that, we link it with basically just Google Earth images. So if anybody has ever gone to Google Earth and just looked at the satellite image, right? We have those images too. And so we have basically a bunch of students sitting down with Google Earth images and saying, hey, this is water, this is not water. So they create a training and a validation data set, which we then use to come up with a nice data set of basic training and validation for water in the Caucasus. We compare all the different indices, and this is actually some work from one of my grad students that just graduated. So James compared a whole bunch of different indices and finally said, I think this MNWI index, which it doesn't matter what it means right now, is probably the most beneficial and the most accurate if we're looking at all sorts of different regions in the Caucasus. And he said it has an accuracy of about 91%, which is pretty good. So in the next step, what we decided to do is to use that information and basically go and map all sorts of small water bodies. And so we went to the fields to validate and also to make sure that what we actually see is actually water. And so we can find a whole bunch of the smaller water bodies and we can find a whole bunch of the smaller irrigation channels, which is very important because when the Soviet Union collapsed and when we had all this war going on, it was mainly these small irrigation channels that were not maintained that then got clogged. And then when they got clogged, they started to kind of flood with water and became beautiful mosquito habitats. And so if we want to understand where malaria occurred, it really helps for us to understand where those areas got clogged. So once we do that, we can generate these maps. And so this is a map which gives you basically for every state, the area within 500 meters of water. Okay. And so you can see that here up in the Karabakh region where there's a lot of mountains, there's not a whole lot of water. There's very few areas that are really close to water. But down here where we saw a lot of the malaria mosquito outbreaks, there's a lot of water going on. And then we can also figure out who lives there, how many people are actually living within 500 meters of water, and what can we do from there. So that's kind of one set of the work that we did. In the next step, we were really interested in also in forests. So what is the impact of deforestation during war situations and during conflict situations? We see a lot of deforestation. And so we started to wonder, can we understand where there was deforestation and what the impact was and how do we study that? So during the conflict, the main sources of power to Armenia were shut off by Azerbaijan and Turkey for many months at a time. And as a result of what they called an energy embargo, people started to cut down trees to supply heat and energy for their households. And then this deforestation, we think in combination with land and irrigation abandonment could have increased mosquito breeding potential. And so we wanted to understand where does this deforestation take place. And so we went back to that kind of same data set that I just described, the data set that we have starting in 1984. This is that same curve again. And we said we can combine, again, these spectral data sets in what we call a brightness, greenness, and wetness index. And again, this brightness, greenness, and wetness actually really is showing you what you think it will show you based on the name. So brightness, the brightness index tells you how bright the land is, the greenness tells you how green the land is, and the wetness tells you how wet the land is. And we've learned over time from many different projects that we can combine those things into what we call a disturbance index. And so if you're looking here on the left, that is your true color image. That is the image that, you know, looks very similar to what you would see if you would be flying over the landscape. In this particular case, I want to show you a few things. These dark areas is where we have regular growing forests. Okay, so when you have a nice looking forest that grows really well, they're usually quite dark. These light green areas are actually agricultural fields. I hope you can kind of see that they look like agricultural fields. And then this white area over here is actually a disturbed piece of forest. Okay, this is an example of an image in New Zealand. But it looks very similar if you go anywhere around the world. And so what happens when we are having a disturbance going on in forests is that our brightness goes up. You can see that this looks very bright compared to the dark forests. Our greenness goes down, doesn't look very green anymore. And then our wetness also goes down. Now we, with our own eyes, cannot really see wetness, but if you have vigorously growing vegetation, there's a lot of water in those leaves, and so there's a lot of wetness there, and that wetness goes down if you take the leaves down. And so we can combine that into this image, and then we can calculate what we call a land disturbance index, which if this index is really high, it looks very disturbed, and when it's low, it's not very disturbed land. Now we do a bunch of standardizations because obviously when you're looking in mountainous areas, which is what we're doing, there's issues with slope, right? Forests on the north facing slopes grow differently and they look differently than forests on south facing slopes. And if you ever walked in the mountains in the summer in the north or in the south of the slopes, you'll know kind of the difference in heat there. And so we standardize it against aspects, north versus south, and also flat slopes. We also we look at also at the data by administrative region. And then we calculate kind of this really big time series of disturbance index values. And now what we can do for every grid cell, every 30-meter grid cell, we can go in and we can say, hey, did something happen here? And so we see a lot of different types of disturbances. We see situations where we have an abrupt disturbance. So remember that if there's no disturbance, our disturbance index is low or negative. And if we have a disturbance, or if our forest is clear cut, it really goes up. And so what you're seeing in this top graph here is a situation where the disturbance index is really low, and then there was a clear cut event, and bam, it went up, and it stayed up pretty high. And so this is a major clear cutting event. We also have degradation events where maybe the disturbance is kind of okay, but then they start to kind of take trees out, not just clear cutting the whole area, but they're just taking trees out here and there, right? So they're starting to do this kind of selective logging. Maybe this is a family, or maybe this is a group of people that take a tree here and there. They're not, you know, a big company. They're just kind of going through it. And so you can see that degradation going up over time. And in the same way, of course, we can also see recovery. So we see some recovery going on as well. Again, we can play with this in the same way again. So we can come up and say, you know, what is, first of all, the percentage of forest in an area? So we can see that here in Georgia, there's a lot of forests. There's definitely forest going into the Karabakh region, and also some forest here in northern Azerbaijan, and then here in the south. And then we can also start looking at forest disturbance. And so you can see that there's quite a bit of disturbance actually going on right around the Karabakh region. Also a lot of disturbance here at the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And that is actually the area that has been quite a bit of fighting again in the 2020 conflicts. There's been quite a bit of fighting right around this region. And then there is some more clear cutting right here in the south around the border, and then also over here. And so obviously we won't have malaria if we don't have people, right? So where are the people? We combine this with good people maps. And then we can figure out who lives where and what is going on. And you can see, you know, there's quite a few people here that are living close to disturbed forests and also down south. So we like to combine all of this information into kind of a model and say, really what happens there, right? It's sometimes a little bit easy to say, well, climate changes, and so climate changes as a result, we see all these things happening. Yes, climate changes. But on top of that, we also have people that are cutting our trees. And then we have changes in the water, and maybe there is, irrigation channels that get stopped up and create mosquito environments. And so we're combining the climate impact, where could we find these mosquitoes, with where do the people live, with what's happening with land use, so the forests and then the water. And we're actually also looking directly at the croplands, which I didn't show in the stock. And then we're trying to understand what is the final disease environment. So all those pieces together make for what we think are the ingredients for a malaria outbreak. So environmental disturbance alone does not generate malaria cases. You need to have prominent mosquito vectors and the Plasmodium parasites to be able to generate that malaria outbreak. And so mosquito vector and the parasites have largely been controlled since the 1970s. And we wanted to understand, what happened? How did these things come back? So first of all, if you're starting on the left side, we are showing that we have a situation where the climate is conducive for these mosquito developments. We also have forest and irrigation croplands and surface water. So we have an environment that is conducive and actually became more conducive because of the changes that we saw on the land surface. Then we have usually mitigation. So usually there's pretty good control of these mosquitoes. However, as a result of the end of the Soviet period, we ended up with a lack of mosquito control. And then on top of that, we started to have a conflict. So there's a war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. We had an energy embargo that really started to influence again the environment and the lack of mitigation. And then the last ingredients we think is necessary, because these first three ingredients still will not generate a mosquito outbreak. It still will not generate a malaria outbreak, right? You have those three ingredients that are very good. And then the fourth ingredient there is human mobility. And so we saw foreign and returning soldiers, and we also saw major amounts of internally displaced people as a result of those conflicts. So I want to talk a little bit about what we saw with the foreign soldiers. So when the conflict broke out, Armenia did not have an organized army. And so they started recruiting soldiers from Ukraine and Chechnya, and then also from Afghanistan. And reports suggest that approximately 1,500 to 2,000 to 2,500 soldiers came from Afghanistan. But from the 1950s until 1979, malaria control in Afghanistan was implemented through this vertical program. But little of that original program remained by the early 1990s. And so Afghanistan also had a major malaria outbreak. And you can actually see the number of cases here reported. Now, these cases are very low, or relatively low here, although we're still reaching about 100,000, partly because they weren't actually looking either, right? So sometimes it doesn't look like we have an outbreak because we're not looking. And so the ability of vivax malaria parasites to lay dormant within an infected individual increases the potential for the introduction of malaria into conflict zones. In other words, these soldiers were most likely infected by malaria, but they didn't know that, right? That was dormant in their body, and they started to travel, and they ended up in other regions where we had generated a situation where the climate was already good, and now the environment was also conducive for this malaria outbreak. So in conclusion, environmental degradation and the disruption of malaria mitigation programs provide that underlying canvas for potential malaria development. But there's teleconnections between these disease outbreaks as a result of human mobility. People travel, they don't stay in one place. And the intersection of malaria emergence and then conflict and also human mobility offer an important example for analyzing the dynamics between the disease and the social, political, and biological environments. And so if we're looking around the world, we see a lot of environments now where maybe we already have an environment that is conducive for infectious disease outbreaks. And now we're also putting on top of that climate change that make these environments even more conducive. And then we have a lot of human mobility right now. And so you can actually put all these pieces together and then generate outbreaks of diseases in places where these outbreaks previously didn't happen. Now, we saw a little bit of this also happen during the 2020 outbreak, conflict situation. And so people left Karabakh to go to Armenia, And in 2020, of course, we had our COVID epidemic. Now, COVID wasn't a climatologically issue, but we do see kind of that movement of people bringing then COVID with them from one place to the next. So the Caucasus region has historically been super, super volatile. Political instability paired with climate change, we believe will increase that risk for tropical disease re-emerging in temperate regions. And we think that land cover land use research paired with social science is really necessary to, kind of really map what is going on and map these trends to understand what is happening there. That is it.
Okay, what questions do you all have for Dr. de Beurs? Also, if you wouldn't mind, just turn on your camera for this part, and especially when you're asking a question. Well, I have a question. Dr. de Beurs, what if malaria does reemerge in this area? Could it somehow create an environment that would allow other diseases to reemerge in that area, or would it be pretty much just malaria from what you know?
So I don't think malaria is what will generate an environment for other diseases to emerge, but I do know that the circumstances, meaning we have a conflict, we have, lack of caring for the environment, has generated an environment where we see other disease outbreaks as well. So during that conflict in the 1990s, we saw major disease outbreaks all over the Caucasus, separate from malaria, that really were under control for many years during the Soviet periods. But then because kind of all the public health structures broke down, we saw these diseases come back. We have another project where we're looking at, it's actually more looking at modern, like what is going on right now. And so China is investing really heavily in infrastructure in Central Asia, for example, through the Belt and Road Initiative. And in that project, we're studying urban areas that are really growing now as a result of the Belt and Road Initiative and investments. And we're trying to understand how does this growth impact kind of your disease environments, because people start to live much closer, for example, to what previously used to be agricultural areas. And we also see disease outbreaks there because people start to move and start to build and start to do different things. And so I think oftentimes we like to study things very separately, which is why I was very excited to hear you guys' conference, right? We like to, you guys are in the city and we are here, and we like to break everybody up in little pieces. But I do think that if we really try to understand how these type of things work, we really need to put these pieces together and study that together. Now, how do you do that in a good way? I think that's interdisciplinary work, right? And sometimes it's just starting to talk, which is what you guys, I think, we're trying to do here, to start this discussion.
A question. Does land use promote evolution of the disease, or is it old strains coming back?
Actually, so I don't think it's old strains coming back. I think actually in this particular case, the disease was brought in from outside. So I think most of this came from Afghanistan, actually. And we see in the same, one of the reasons why I'm thinking that as well is that we see during the same time outbreaks of malaria occur, for example, in Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. And there were also, because of the situation in Afghanistan wasn't politically stable. And so people started to move out of Afghanistan, going into other regions, and they brought it with them. And because there was not as much local control, the environment started to kind of break down and make it, itself conducive to these outbreaks. This could start to proliferate, basically saying, if you had somebody coming from Afghanistan with malaria and they come here in the United States, where we have, a good public health system, where we're taking care of our water, and nobody will get malaria from that, right? It's not like we're going to generate a malaria outbreak just because we are letting in displaced people. That's not refugees. That's not how it works. It's just that because these people ended up in an environment where the social control was breaking down and the public health systems weren't working, and the environmental systems, for example, croplands weren't working, was it able to start growing there? Does that make sense?
Hi, Dr. Beurs. I do have a question as well. What political entities control land use in the Caucasus region in general?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
What political entities control land use in the Caucasus region?
Well, so it depends, right? So right now, these are independent countries. So Armenia is an independent country and the government is in charge there. You have independent farmers, you have state control, you have regional control, and a lot of changes have changed. A lot of political changes have happened in Armenia as well in the last so many years. But in general, there is a regular, similar system as we have here in the United States. What happened in the early 1990s is that they used to be part of the Soviet Union. So a lot of that control was very, very centralized coming from Moscow. And then when the Soviet Union started to break apart in the early 1990s, there was kind of this vacuum, right? So you had very strong centralized control. That centralized control basically fell apart, and these countries had to pick up their own government systems and set everything up themselves and start working on that. But at the same time, the war broke out. And so they were a little preoccupied in getting those things going. And so there was very little control at that point. And I think it's many times those type of situations where we see these type of disease outbreaks come back. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good.
Dr. Beurs, I had a question as well. I was curious if remote sensing that you talked about for the land, is that legal to do of other countries, or do we just do it?
It's legal. There's a lot of different satellites. So I showed you the Landsat program, but there's a lot of different types of programs. The Landsat program is maybe one of the older programs, like the longest standing program at 30-meter data. We have data at 1 kilometer. We have the European Union has big satellites right now that are flying. They're actually recording at 10-meter or 20-meter spatial resolution. We have images all over the world. These type of things are ruled by space treaties. And so, yeah, it's not illegal. In fact, all of this data is in the public domain. You can go download all this data yourself if you want to. It's free. You can work with it. There's easy ways to actually start working with this data now. It becomes easier and easier. People from all over the world are working with this data. We have similar data sets here, like looking at Oklahoma, for example. And so if you were somebody in Azerbaijan that said, gosh, I really want to study Oklahoma, I don't know why, but you could, right? You could go and get the same type of data sets from Oklahoma and see how the poultry farms are really growing in northeastern Oklahoma, if that's where you're thinking.
So I have another question as well, Dr. Beurs, and forgive me in advance, I may be kind of struggling with how to verbalize this too a little bit. Just thinking in terms of prevention, especially for reemergence in the future, especially given conflicts like you mentioned again in 2020. Obviously, a lot of this is kind of bound by the fact that this is in an interconflict zone in a stateless space. And so aside from the work of nonprofits, thinking like Partners in Health, Doctors Without Borders, kind of what potential entities exist to maybe produce some of that public health surveillance, or I don't know, just thinking of maybe potential like mitigation efforts in the future, aside from obviously like peacemaking type of kind of like political measures as well.
It's a very tricky thing. In this particular case, one of the difficulties here was that there used to be malaria in this region, but it was under control for so long, like since the 60s, that the public health people in the country itself that were there didn't think about it, didn't pay attention to it. And the World Health Organizations that are there, and even your like peacemakers and aid workers, didn't really think about it. Just like maybe if somebody gets malaria here in Oklahoma, it will take a little while for somebody to say, oh gosh, you clearly have malaria, right? Because it's not something on the top of your head because you're not thinking about this all the time. I mean, you may say, have you been traveling? Have you been doing this? Have you been doing that? But if the answer is like, no, your brain doesn't jump to saying, oh, you must be having malaria when somebody comes in with recurrent fevers, right? And I think that is what happened there. And we see this quite a bit around the world when there's outbreaks of diseases as a result of conflict, is that we kind of forget what could have been there, especially if the diseases have been under control a lot for a long time. And so thinking about what has been brought in, maybe you have not been traveling, but maybe you have been sitting right next to somebody who has been traveling. And now we're seeing these diseases come back. And so, yeah, it's a difficult thing in that way. There is a little bit of a period of time that maybe is hard to prevent, but being aware that your land use change can really play a role there too, and modeling things out, like we can model it out now. So we can start saying, hey, this environment is really conducive for X, right? And so the idea here is that if we can study these things and we can maybe come up with maps, we can at least give a heads up to aid workers and say, well, you really have to also start thinking about these diseases because environmentally this can really help in there. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Dr. Beurs, I also have a question. I was just kind of wondering, how viable is it to extrapolate, kind of these, not even these ideas, like this actual practice of mapping land usage to trace kind of like malaria spread in other parts of the world? Like how much could we do this in areas of Central America right now? They're dealing with lots of deforestation. Or could we even see this looking at vulnerable parts of the American Southeast, spreading of diseases, climate change and deforestation throughout like vulnerable parts of American communities? Is this something we can extrapolate easily to other areas?
I think so. So there's two things here. The remote sensing data is available and studies have been done. Like, remote sensing is used a lot, for example, to study malaria environments in Africa. We have seen some studies going on in South America where there's deforestation and also mining. There's a little bit of lawlessness sometimes surrounding the mining communities, and then there's clear cuts. And so we see these disease banners and we can follow that from space. So I think to a certain extent that land use component, I think works very similar, and we can use very similar methods to understand what's going on. I do think, and I hope you kind of got that from the talk, is that every situation is different and there's a lot of kind of pieces that come together, which is where you want that interdisciplinary type of approach. In this particular case, we have the climate that is changing and it's suitable. We have the environment that's changing and suitable, but we also have the conflict, and we also have, people traveling. And so I think that's where your interdisciplinary thinking comes in, and that will be quite different for every type of, study that you're doing. But the remote sensing data absolutely is, yeah. I feel very confident that we can use that for other areas.
Just so you know, we have 2 minutes left in this session.
I hope that answered your question. I do want to add kind of, I know you guys come all from different backgrounds, but I do want to kind of just let you know that this data is available. The data is also free. And we are always super helpful and wanting to collaborate if there's people that say, hey, I would really like to see this, that, or the other, or maybe, I want to learn a little bit about this. Obviously, we do our classes, but there's also lots of room for collaborations and so forth. So. Thanks for your attention.